Hi everyone, welcome to this week's webinar. Hope everyone's well and enjoying this half sunny day, half wet day. So this week's webinar is all about the tenant and how to get the ideal tenant in. We've either read horror stories about it or we've experienced it ourselves in terms of having a negative tenant. Sometimes it's just one of those things. You could do all what we've said or what we're going to say on this webinar, and still you may get an unruly tenant in. That's just something that sometimes you just can't avoid. But what we'll do is it's our role here to put things in place to ideally avoid that. Now, for me, the biggest way to avoid a bad tenant is by buying the right property. For those people who've bought the wrong property previously, and got a tenant in and wondered why they've got a bad tenant, well, typically that's because they've got a property that actually just wasn't geared up to getting the ideal tenant in. So, for example, we've got clients who have come to us in the past, let's go round figures, they've had £250,000, and rather than buying one or two properties with that, they've gone to an area on the outskirts of a city, they've bought sort of 3 to 4 properties with that, and typically the cheaper the property, the lower the rent is going to be, obviously, and then you get a certain type of tenant who can't afford the more expensive rents, and typically then what happens is you just simply struggle with getting the right quality of tenant in. The best tenants are the tenants that are hardly ever there. They typically use it to sleep. That's typically like a young professional, a young worker, who they're either out most of the time. That means less wear and tear on your property. And also they're just literally sleeping there. The best tenant will obviously have someone with references, the right amount of income. The worst kind of tenant is where their past is a little bit sketchy in regards to job-wise, income-wise, bad references. And also, you know, I've got a big family myself. However, I know just from what happens in my household, kids, hands on the walls and things like that, you typically buy a house with sort of 3-4 bedrooms, you're going to rent to a family. That family has a number of children. The children, inevitably things happen, walls get drawn on, handprints, so you're constantly refurbishing that property every single year or every couple of years, and suddenly that eats into your profits. But as I say, to me, the tenant, the search for the tenant starts actually even before that you've purchased the property. You buy the right property, typically you can get the right tenant. But without further ado, whether you use ourselves or whether you use other external companies to let your property, some of you guys might do it yourself, but typically we say these things have to be done. This is something that we do with every single tenant. It's more difficult to do a lot of these checks yourself, so that's why we always recommend using a professional agency, but this is what we would recommend. So first of all, the income and the credit. If you run a credit report for the applicant, you get part of the picture. But what we will do is we will go further in depth than that. So you've got the right to confirm that the applicant has sufficient income to cover the rent. Now, we will ask for wage slips, not just one wage slip, we will ask for a number of wage slips just to ensure that that person has been in the job the time that they have stated. And we will make sure that the particular tenant has enough, not just to scrimp and scrape, but to actually ensure that they can comfortably cover the rent. So that's a really important aspect. Get the wage slips. You're more than entitled to ask for it, and that's something that we would do. Again, look at their background of employment. So many ways to look at people's background of employment these days. You could do a simple basic check on LinkedIn for most people. Most people have a public profile. Look at LinkedIn, how long they've been in their job. We can go a bit deeper into that, and we can ask for a certain amount of wage slips. But look at what is at your fingertips. Places like LinkedIn is a great place to find out how long they've particularly been in that particular role. Again, if they've had large gaps in employment, why? You're more than within your right to question why, what's happened on that gap, and if they have a job role, or they have a self-employed role where they typically have lots of gaps, then we need to make sure that, again, go back to point one, the income is enough to cover those particular gaps. Again, a credit check for us is so important. It's imperative. If you've got someone that has a minor flag, don't get me wrong, if it's a flag from many years ago, then that's something that may be a little slip up in regards to, I forgot a credit card bill or something like that. But if they've got a number of red flags, again, that's something that we would just simply avoid. A number of red flags in terms of a credit check, and someone's got who has problems managing their money, is not someone that you want in your particular property. Again, this is just the start of our checks, what we would do. And if you use any other agent, ensure that these checks are fully done. If they fail any of the above, it will increase the risk that your tenant will make late payments. And typically what happens with the tenant, if they don't typically make a huge late payment, there'll be a few days late initially, then it gets later, and then you'll get sort of 3-4 weeks later, and then you're in arrears by a month, and it's a nightmare with the Eviction Act. Nowadays, it's not that straightforward just to say, right, you're not living here anymore. There are certain legal loopholes that you have to go through to get this process under wraps. So importantly, you make sure it's right from the start, everything goes swimmingly. Moving on to the next step is in terms of what the urgency and the trust side of things. Many tenants out there are naturally fearful that the verification process, they're going to fall down on it. So what they try and do is speed through. I want to move in within a week. Can we get it done? Hoping that the agency will just be, yeah, do you know what? That's how we make our money. Therefore, we'll rush it through and we'll not do some of the checks. That's really not what you want to do. As a landlord, you can ask for what checks have been done, and you can ask for proof of these checks. There will be certain parts of information that can't be sent over under sort of Data Protection Act, but there are certain checks that have been done that you can ensure that have been done, and get it in writing from the agent that those checks have been done and what was done and when. So as I say, the tenant will typically want to rush, move in, hoping that the agent will skip some checks, and more often than not, the agent will probably skip those checks because that's how their agent is earning the money. They earn money when someone goes through the door and pays that first month's rent. My advice is literally wait. If someone wants to rush to move in, question why. Why haven't they been looking? Why is it such a rush? But doesn't matter if it's a rush. You've got to do all the checks. You'd rather get all the checks done and wait 3 weeks for your rent, for your income, rather than sort of rushing it in a week and then 6 months down the line you regret making that decision. Any applicants who want to pay 6 months in cash or 3 months in cash, you've got to question why. Not all the time that will be negative, but you've got to question why. A lot of people will pay sort of 3 months up front or 6 months up front if they don't go through the necessary checks. They'll put a bigger guarantee down, but sometimes in these cases it's a red herring. You get the 6 months, and then when it gets to the 7th month, they don't pay, 8th month don't pay, and you're back to square one again. So again, not that it's always a negative if they want to pay 6 months up front, but you've just got to question why. Again, applicants who pay cash or self-employed, they do require a lot more due diligence to confirm their outcome. But again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning. You choose the right property at the start, you give yourself far better options and far better opportunities in terms of when it comes to rent. If you've got something on the outskirts of the city, you know that you're going to get far less of a potential tenant pipeline than if you were a city centre. Again, we've got, for example, projects in Manchester, and we know that some projects are only 5-10 minutes apart, or walking, not even driving, walking, and the difference in terms of the amount of leads that come through. We've got one, and we can put an advert out, and it will generate 25 to 30 applicants within a day. 10 minutes down the road, walk, and you will literally may trickle through 1 or 2. So that's a huge difference in terms of the choices that you have, and it's all about making sure that the purchase is right from the start. Now, in terms of references as well, this is a lot of agents. I know a lot of agents who miss this out. People put references on there and ask for references, ask for previous landlords, ask for references, because that is a big tick. If they have a great reference from a previous landlord, or the company owner or the manager that they're working for, that is a big plus point. So again, don't let anyone rush or tempt you into ignoring your protective measures with money. Make sure that the due diligence is done. Again, one of the most difficult tenants to handle is it has such a negative impact. It actually puts people off of buying a buy-to-let property. I've had clients before who have said, oh, I purchased a property, everything was great for the first year, and then suddenly I just don't want to purchase buy-to-let anymore. The person that was in it didn't pay after 12 months. I had to go to court, small claims court, to evict them. It took me 6 months. That really negates the whole process. This whole process should be enjoyable. Buy-to-let property is still one of the best places to put your money, and importantly, it should be a straightforward process. What you don't want to do is have a negative experience. Okay, you might have 10 properties and you may have one negative experience, but if you're having, buying 2 or 3 properties and having negative experiences with all of them, something has to be said of either you bought the wrong property in the first place or the checks haven't been done moving along. Again, there are types of tenants who will literally make certain remarks. They need to be picked up on. It may be anything along the lines of they go in and they start to talk about, well, what wear and tear. We've had tenants go in previously and they start to talk about what wear and tear and what damage is appropriate. Now that's a big red flag for us. If they're talking already about wear and tear and damage and what's appropriate, and they want certain things in writing, my concern will be, well, they've been somewhere before where they've had a bad experience and they've already had a negative experience with not getting deposits back due to wear and tear and damage. So that's a big no-no at the start. Again, this is something where an agency will come into their own. And like I say, everything in the rental application, run credit checks. We have forms that are so meticulous that the client fills them in, that if anything doesn't add up or something doesn't match, again, it's a no. We would rather leave an apartment empty than have a hassle client, and it just works for the client in the long run. And as I mentioned, speak to previous landlords. It's such a big plus point, and speak to employers. I can't emphasize that enough. That's probably one of the best things that can be done, because that's the here and now. You may have a bad credit check from 5 years ago, but in the here and now, that person, if they're getting on extremely well at work and if their previous landlord's satisfied, that's a big plus point. The ideal tenant, as I say, it's part of the journey. When I say it's part of the journey, it's probably 90% of the journey. Yes, you're going to make growth in property if you hold it long enough. Doesn't matter whether there's a dip in the market, the property market always recovers. But your ideal tenant is an integral part of your buy-to-let journey. It's the day-to-day running of that particular project and the day-to-day income that you get and what you get remunerated every month, which makes it all worthwhile, especially when you can compare making 6-7% in a residential property, or 10% in a property that we can run through Skylet, or 0.5% in your bank. It makes it an exciting experience. But that experience gets really dampened with a negative tenant. So get that ideal tenant is twofold. One, as I mentioned, getting the right property, and 2, ensuring that all the checks and all the due diligence is done by the agent or by yourself. Determining that type of tenant, as I say, before you want to do anything else. So even now, clients come into us and we're asking them, what type of tenant do you think you're going to get with that particular mindset? So if you're looking at buying £50,000 properties and buying 4 of them, what type of tenant are you going to get? And so let's look in that area and let's look at the type of tenants that you will typically get. Well, let's look at the rent in that area. So for example, we had a client recently and he bought £40,000 properties in Bradford. We then go onto the rental side. What will they rent out for? They may rent out for £200, £250 a month. What type of tenant do you typically get for that? You cannot put any more no DSS. You can't turn around and discriminate and put no DSS tenants on there. So again, you have to accept everyone, and they don't have to declare that. So importantly, you cannot discriminate against that. So it all comes from the choice of property at the start. In terms of what we do, we take care of both sides. We take care of who you're renting, or what property you're buying initially, and then who you're renting to. And again, our application process is so stringent. We would rather leave something empty for a month than have a negative tenant 6 months down the line. We'll keep you posted throughout. We do regular viewings. It's not that we leave them in there for 6 months and then go and view it. We will, at the first 3 months, we'll be there every single month doing spot checks, then every 3 months thereafter. So we will keep everything up to date and ensure that we take itineraries from the start and make sure that the applicants have gone through the right process. In terms of everything else, as I say, guys, it comes down to day one, ensuring that you're thinking about your tenant prior to even making a purchase. It is impossible to guarantee anything. Any agent that says, yeah, we'll guarantee you won't get an unruly tenant, will guarantee that this won't happen in your property. That's a myth. You will potentially, if you buy enough buy-to-let properties, you'll always have a negative experience in one. What we will do and what other agents should do is ensure that that is mitigated as much as possible by buying the right property and ensuring that the application process for the tenants have been done properly. Over to you guys. Again, you should have sort of like a speech bubble or a question mark. Feel free to ask any questions. I've got a couple that come through already. The first one, I have a buy-to-let already. I've had it for a number of years. I have a tenant in there who hasn't paid for 6 months. What's the next step? Well, first question I would ask is, are you using an agent or are you doing it yourself? If it's an agent, they should be on top of this, and it shouldn't be 6 months. You should have, after a couple of months, you should have done eviction. If not, you should have gone to the court process. That should be well under its way already. So if you've got an agent on it, I would ask the question, why aren't they doing that? Feel free, there's a number that's come up on your screen there. So feel free to phone that number and speak to me directly, and I'll help you with that, and I'll point you in the right direction. In terms of that, that really shouldn't be the case. If you're doing it yourself, again, I would have definitely gone to court by now after 6 months of no rent. That really shouldn't be the case. Next question. How much to spend on a property to ensure that you don't get a bad tenant? Again, it depends on the area. For example, if you've got £200,000 and you invest it in Liverpool, you can go and get a really great looking property, city centre, and you can get a really good top tenant in there. Again, you can't eradicate it totally, but again, the chances are you've got a great tenant. If you take that same £200,000 and take it to London, the chances are you're going to get something on the outskirts in an area which is not too inviting, and you get a lesser class of tenant, which simply means that you've got more chance of having a bad tenant down the line. So it really depends. It depends on your budget. It depends on how long you're looking to hold it for, because there are some areas on the outskirts of the cities that are being done up and are being regenerated. Therefore, that's a totally different ball game than something where you're just literally buying it because it's cheap. We have people here that have been to auctions over the years, and we say the same thing. This is probably for another webinar, but you're never going to beat a builder at an auction. A builder can always, renovate a property cheaper than you can. A builder doesn't have to pay VAT, or they can claim that VAT back, I should say. So you've got no chance of beating a builder. So if a builder isn't bidding on that property, the chances are you're not going to make money on it either. However, we've had people that buy at auctions and they've bought in derelict roads, and again, they've got houses next door to them each side with boarded up windows, but their house is renting pretty cheap. You know that certain type of tenant that you're going to attract. So what we basically say to you is, again, it all comes down to knowing a bit more about you, how long you're looking to hold it for, what your budget is, and what your aspirations are. Have I ever had an unruly tenant? Yeah, I have. Ironically, the first property I purchased was in Oxford. It was a 4-bed house. I then extended it to a 6-bed house. This was for a buy-to-let. It was rented out to students, and one of those particular students didn't pay. The house wasn't smashed up. There was nothing negative about it. The student literally, hold my hands up. I was probably much younger, very naive in terms of certain things. And this particular tenant, she came in halfway through the year, didn't have the right checks, but it was okay. We'll get her in, get some more money through the door. And yeah, as I say, for me, that was probably one that I look back on. But it was a great experience to get that under the belt, because you're never going to avoid an unruly tenant. There's always going to be that particular chance of having a negative tenant. But again, over the years, there's so many sort of tips and tricks that we've picked up that we will literally adhere to everything to ensure that you don't get that. Well, I hope that's helped, guys. As I say, like I said, to summarize, there's no hard and fast rule. There's no perfect rule to ensure that that's not going to happen. But if you do everything and tick as many boxes as you can get, you can avoid to try and get the majority of those bad tenants that we read about in the newspapers, and they try and put a negative slant on the industry. Well, I hope that's helped, and anything that you need, feel free to get in touch, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Take care.